Andrew Jackson was the seventh President of the United States, as well as a respected Army general in the War of 1812. Today we will be touring his crib, the Hermitage. When the British provoked Indian attacks in the West and seizing ships and sailors in the Atlantic, Jackson and others demanded war in defense of American security and rights. When the War of 1812 came, he led an offensive against the Native Americans, and soon after, he took the defense of the Mississippi River when the British attempted to sever the United States. At New Orleans in 1815, Jackson threw the British back. This victory brought him much praise, and people began putting him second only behind Washington. Andrew Jackson ran in the election of 1824. Jackson actually received the most popular and electoral votes with 99. However, it was not enough for the majority, so the House was left with the difficult task of selecting the next president among three candidates with the highest electoral votes. With Henry Clay clearly out of the running, he decided to lend his support to Quincy. With Clay's endorsement, Quincy was able to win election in the House. Quincy went to name Clay Secretary of State, which had long been the next door to presidency. Jackson's supporters cried foul and dubbed this election the corrupt bargain. However, Jackson would run once more in the election of 1828, in an election full of controversy with accusation being thrown on each candidate of misdoings and bad morals. Jackson came out the decisive winner, holding 56% of the popular votes and an electoral majority of 178 votes. Jackson was inaugurated on March 4th, 1829, and sworn in by Supreme Justice John Marshall. A major topic that was of much controversy during Jackson's presidency was the issue of the Second National Bank. Jackson strongly opposed rechartering the bank, vetoing it in 1832, and listing these reasons as why in his veto message. It concentrated the nation's financial strength in a single institution. It exposed the government to control by foreign interests. It served mainly to make the rich richer. It exercised too much control over members of Congress. It favored northeastern states over southern and western states, and that banks are controlled by a few select families. Jackson was successful in crushing the bank with this veto and by withdrawing U.S. funds in 1833. The Hermitage stands on 625 acres of farmland, based on the 425 acres originally purchased by Jackson in 1804 from his neighbor Nathaniel Hayes for $3,400.
By 1830, the mansion had two wings, including a dining room and a library that were added to the mansion. In 1834, tragedy hit the home as a spark from the back parlor chimney fell on the oak shingle roof and set the house on fire.
As stated earlier, Andrew Jackson was elected president in November of 1828. However, in December, sadly, Mrs. Jackson passed away at the age of 61.
The house did not remain unoccupied, however, as Jackson's adopted son, Andrew Jr., and his wife Sarah then occupied the home. The Jacksons lived in a log cabin complex close to the site where the new house was built for 15 years before the mansion was completed.
The room that best represents him is his office or library. For years, it was the center of political and Democratic Party affairs. The dining room is the most historically significant room in the mansion. Presidents James Polk and Franklin D. Roosevelt have visited it as a historic shrine.
Jackson's ground floor remains almost the same as the day he died. The personal items in his room include his tobacco box, leather hat box, hair, clothes brushes, and a French china teapot.
The back parlor contains a mahogany center table that was presented to Jackson when he returned to New Orleans after the battle that made him famous there. Former President Jackson returned to the Hermitage in 1837 to spend the last 8 years of his life there and welcome many people from across the country at his mansion.
Slaves did the heavy work on the Hermitage. Jackson owned fewer than a dozen field hands during the early years of the new place, but as the operations expanded, he purchased more. By 1820, he held 4 dozen slaves, including his cook and house servants. By 1829, he owned perhaps 100, making him one of the largest slave owners in Tennessee. The product grown at the Hermitage was mostly cotton and corn. Alfred Jackson was one of these slaves. He was born into slavery at the Hermitage around 1812. In 1901, he was laid to rest at his own request near the tomb where Mr. and Mrs. Jackson now lie. He wanted to remain close to the president.
Jackson died at the Hermitage on June 5, 1845, at the age of 78, and his request he was buried next to his wife Rachel in the tomb he had ordered built for her in 1831 on the Hermitage grounds in the back of the garden. This church on the residence is known as Rachel's Church. It was built as Mrs. Jackson's request in 1823.
Well, that was the Hermitage. We hope you enjoyed your visit.